honored to have Eric Nee with us. Eric Nee has more than 35 years of experience in the publishing industry. Before joining the Stanford University, he was a senior writer for Fortune. While there, Eric helped Time Inc. launch e-company, now where he was an executive director, which later became Business 2.0. Before joining Fortune, Eric launched Forbes Silicon Valley Bureau, where he was the bureau manager. He also served as the editor-in-chief of Upside magazine for close to 5 years. Today, he joins the Arthan Social Forum as part of a Future of Work series in a fireside chat, talking about social impact, innovation, and the role of journalism in reshaping the world. Though something this has not been talked about, I'm very, very curious to learn about how do we change the narrative. Keeping in mind the narratives we see these days are definitely not very hopeful, but I will probably leave that to Eric and hear him out. Thank you so much for joining us, Eric. I know it's late at night for you, so taking the time out, matching this time difference for Arthan community in South Asia, we are very, very honored to have you with us.
Well, I'm really happy to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. Yeah, it's 8 p.m. at night here, but that's still within reason. It's not, I think I'm still awake. So I'm really looking forward to having this conversation. I think the topics that you are exploring in this event are so important, the future of work. It's something we've explored a bit in the magazine. And of course, it's on everybody's minds as we have technologies like artificial intelligence come on, the growing inequality that we see in income. And these issues, I think, are going to be presenting themselves even more as we go forward in the future.
Absolutely, Eric. On that note, Eric, I would like to, as I was setting up the background, and I would like to begin with, how do you expect the philanthropy to adopt and change as we enter 2021, especially in light of the COVID-19? Because whatever has been the past is not going to be the future. We know that well.
No, that's certainly true. And in the last year, in so many ways, has been different. I've had these conversations with numbers of philanthropists and foundation leaders, actually around the world, about what's changing, and also importantly, are these changes that we've seen in the last year going to continue, or will philanthropy and foundations, kind of revert back to the norm? I think that's the thing that's important, and that obviously is kind of unknowable till we get there. But I do think a lot of the changes that we've seen in the last year are going to stick, because they were things that were beginning to evolve anyway. So, for example, I think there's been a movement and a real push toward philanthropy giving general operating grants rather than project grants. In the past, a lot of philanthropists like to have control. Not that that's gone away, but they want to really know where their money's going. So they will give it for one specific project. And often they don't even provide enough money for overhead expenses, which they sort of pretend that those things don't exist. But more and more people have been providing general operating grants. And we've seen that really increase a lot in the last year, because what they really needed to do is just support fully the nonprofits in the work that they were doing, whether it was, kind of immediate COVID relief or whatnot. Another change that I think we've seen that I do think is going to continue is foundations working together more collaboration rather than working independently. We've seen some of these things like co-impact emerge, where you've got a number of big foundations working together. You have funder collaboratives around important issues like climate change and poverty. And I do think that was a trend that was continuing. And under COVID, it's continued, it's kind of amplified, because you've got such an immediate problem that no single foundation can think of solving on its own. And so immediately they began to work together to we really need to fund these food banks in a particular city or state. the third thing that's kind of related is I think foundations are doing much more partnering with government. Um, again, that is something that had been in the past, but I think it's really accelerated in the last year. And I think out of those experiences, both government and philanthropy is seeing the benefits of that. Somebody that I know very well who teaches social entrepreneurship at Stanford was brought in by California Governor Gavin Newsom specifically to broker those kind of partnerships between government, state government, and philanthropists. And it's really created huge impact within the state and allowed both the government to really do some things that it couldn't have done on its own. Then there's I think some other things that that's happened over the last year that I think are interesting, and maybe if you're a foundation, maybe not viewed positively. For example, there's been a real questioning, at least in the United States, over the fact that these foundations have so much money, and many of these big foundations like Ford and Hewlett are foundations that are set up to operate in perpetuity, so they have huge endowments, huge. Yet they only spend 5% a year. And so a lot of people are looking at that and they're saying, wait, you have, let's say, $10 billion in your endowment, but you're only going to grant 500 million in an emergency like this? And people are kind of incredulous. There's donor advised funds where a lot of money is parked. And so there's been kind of, you might almost call it a backlash against all the wealth that the foundations and philanthropists are holding. I'm not sure it's entirely valid, because there's something to be said for having foundations like Ford and Rockefeller that have been around 100 years and really have accumulated a lot of learning and experience. And the idea that they should just spend down this year and go away, I think that's actually a mistake. But nevertheless, I think it's raised some interesting issues that aren't going to go away. And in fact, there's legislation that's being proposed in the US to force foundations to spend more. So those are, just several things that I think we've seen and that I think, are probably going to continue for at least the foreseeable future.
I'm glad you touched upon the endowment, and especially for the large foundations. Later in the day today, we have MacArthur Foundation and Ford coming in. So
you do?
definitely be worth talking to them and asking them, because the questions around endowment has been there for a while, and especially in light of the pandemic, I think one needs to look at accelerated giving, right? I mean, this is a time when you probably want to give more rather than give less. It's not time for the cutback. And largely speaking, we have noticed that this ambiguity in the foundation strategy, which has arisen because of the pandemic, it's also taking forever. I mean, sometimes you need to be agile enough when it comes to disasters like that or pandemics like that. We can't wait and watch and create a strategy, for a year, because just the same manner, the way the vaccine is coming out, probably we need these strategies to happen very, very fast. With that, I mean, Eric, you also touched upon and gave examples of how the professor from Stanford was invited by the governor in California. I would like to understand more. What do you think about the role of collective impact and collaboration in creating systems change? And you touched upon co-impact, but if you want to give our audience more insight on how can people collaborate better, what is a successful collaboration, and why is it important for the civil society organizations going forward?
Yeah. As I said, I mean, I think partnerships of various types, funder collaboratives, for example, are important and growing in importance. So, a lot of people talk about collective impact, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but in a kind of generic sense, right? We need to work collectively to have impact. Well, collective impact is actually a term that refers to a specific type of practice. And we ran an article 10 years ago, almost to the day, called Collective Impact that really laid out a set of criteria for what they said was an effective and proven way for groups to work together on a big, complex problem. Those practices include things like having a common agenda, which seems obvious, but it's not always done. Having a common agenda, having a set of mutually reinforcing activities so that the individual groups obviously are doing different things, but they have to reinforce one another. Having a backbone organization that actually can coordinate the work. Having shared measurement tools so that we all can measure the progress that we're making individually and collectively against some metric. And then having communication. So those things seem kind of obvious, but in fact, when you dig down into a lot of collaborations and partnerships, many of them don't actually do all that. So collective impact as a practice, there are now thousands of collective impact initiatives around the world. There's a collective impact forum. We've published dozens of articles on collective impact, and it's very important trend, but it's most useful for what are called complex problems. So ones where there's not a simple and obvious solution. So take education or poverty, right? There's no simple solution, no single organization, no single sector is actually going to solve that. So that's why you need a collective practice doing those various type of things. But there's many other kinds of partnerships that are equally important. So I mentioned funder collaboratives, right? They're not really collective impact. It's just funders. It's not organizations from across sectors. And they're, pooling their money to go tackle a problem like climate. We've also seen public-private partnerships. And when I say public-private partnerships, I want to make that distinct from a collective impact. So, for example, the development and the distribution of vaccines, I would say is a great example of a public-private partnership where you've got government working with the private sector, each doing what it can do best. The private sector doing the development work, the government guaranteeing they're going to buy, certain amount of the vaccine and distributing it out to, health clinics and hospitals. So, those are just a couple of different types of partnerships, but I think, in general, they're critical. I mean, there's obviously some types of work where, a single organization, can do pretty well by just, doing it by itself. But those tend to be very kind of limited, very specific issues and problems and services. When you start talking about big problems, like sanitation and clean water, and those things quickly become usually complicated, and you really do need a collaborative effort.
And I think, I'm glad you touched upon sanitation, clean water, clean air. I think something that is universally impacting everyone, just like the way the pandemic impacted everyone. But for a change, everyone reacted very quickly to it, and there was a collective action, right? In case of at least the response, learning from each other, different countries, especially the ones which where the pandemic happened earlier, they were sort of like telling the protocols to the rest of the world. Something worth thinking about, that what if this pandemic can create a movement where people don't look at the geographical boundaries, don't look at the economic powers, and just act and share the knowledge and the responses. Probably why can't we do the same thing for clean water, clean air, and climate change?
I think that's a legitimate question. And also the governments being willing to spend big amounts of money, in the US, a couple $1 trillion. They say on the one hand, we can't afford to do climate change, act on climate change. Well, actually you can afford it. It's a question of will. Can people change their behaviors, right? That's another thing with climate change. People won't, stop driving their car or flying. Not that we all want to be locked down, but it does show that if there's a real need to do something, we can tackle it. Just as you said, it's not impossible. it takes will. I mean, it also takes urgency. And I think that's what's clear about the pandemic is that the urgency is there because your grandmother, may have gotten COVID. They may have even, passed away, or, the problem is immediate and it affects everybody, right? So, I mean, poverty, one would hope that we would all feel urgent about it, but the fact is, many people, myself included, it's not something that touches me directly. And so, am I going to actually do all the things that one could do to solve it? Probably not. I'm just being straightforward with you. And climate change is so off in the distance, right? I mean, it's we all know that it's going to happen, and we can sort of see it because temperatures are rising. But it's kind of like the classic example of, if you want to kill a frog, you don't drop them into boiling water because they'll hop right out, but you just put them in the water and then you gradually start boiling it, and then they'll sit there, slowly die. That's not to sound, kind of dire, but I think that's the difference between the pandemic and climate change.
Makes sense. No, makes a lot of sense. I think, what do you think? I mean, you come from a very, very stellar, strong journalism background. And you have actually not just been in the social impact space. I mean, you have been in the I would say the commercial side of the journalism. But what do you think is the role of journalism in the social impact space, and how do you see that changing, evolving in the next few years? I'm linking it back to, again, how do we build these narratives and don't let go of it, so that again 10 years down the line, when there's another pandemic, people should not say, hey, this happened in the past. Like, and journalism can play a huge role in that.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. I mean, I've been a journalist for my entire professional career. As you said, actually almost approaching 40 years now, as you can see from the gray hair. But so I obviously believe in the power of journalism to bring important news and information and ideas to people that then they can act on, right? I mean, that's kind of the theory of change of doing journalism. A couple of things that I'll just want to highlight. I think the traditional kind of, let's say, theory of change of journalism is that the journalist's role is kind of a watchdog. We'll go in and expose a problem, and then we'll move on to the next problem. And it's up to society, governments, people, organizations to act, to be, after being alerted to the problem, to then act on it, right? And that, I think that role is important, but I think it misses an essential piece that journalism can also do, which is to look at the solutions, right? I mean, uncovering a problem is important, but if you don't give people, information about, can this actually be solved, and if so, how? I think we're sort of missing an important part of the puzzle. And I'd say the emergence of what's called solutions journalism. There's actually a thing called Solutions Journalism Network that was founded by a friend of mine, David Bornstein, that now has thousands of members around the country. Is a really important trend, and they begin to get the attention of traditional media. I mean, I'd say that's what we've been doing from the get-go, right? I mean, our approach is social innovation, right? So innovation is ideas, new practices, new approaches, new technologies to solve social problems. So that's what we've always been doing, but it hasn't been that widespread, but it's growing. The other thing I'll say is that, I came from the business world. You mentioned Forbes and Fortune. There are so many publications covering business, traditional business, right? I mean, it's just amazing, right? There's no dearth of coverage. There has been a dearth of coverage of the social change field and nonprofits and philanthropy and social enterprises. I was sort of shocked when I moved over from Fortune to come to SSIR, because I was like, wow, this is such an interesting and important area. How come nobody's covering it, right? Well, how come is because, several things, right? I mean, commercial media is after profits, right? Either advertising or subscriptions, but advertising's been the traditional model. And there just wasn't an ad model for coverage of groups trying to come up with creative new ways to help with healthcare. So I do think that's changing. I mean, I've been at SSIR since 2006, so about 15 years. And since I've been here, we've grown quite a bit. But there's also been new publications that have emerged. I know in India you have, India Development Review.
Right.
There's a lot of new podcasts and videos, and there's still not as much coverage as there should be, right?
Right.
So I don't feel competitive with any of those folks. In fact, we tend to collaborate with like IDR.
Right.
But I do think it's growing, but it's still really not where it should be. And I'll take this opportunity just to sort of tell you something, about SSIR, about what we're doing. So, I mean, we've, in the last couple of years, seeing that, social innovation and social change is a global phenomenon. And there's things that we can all learn from one another, right? Hopefully, that's why I'm on talking with you, right? And
Right.
I think, there's been somewhat of a missed opportunity there. There's not like a Bloomberg, right? Global, or BBC, or, global coverage of in different languages of this phenomenon, but we are trying to write that. So in the last 2 years, we've launched, in partnership with organizations in each of these countries, local language editions of SSIR. So we have a Chinese language edition that we publish with a partner in Beijing. We have a Korean language edition. We have just launched a Arabic language edition with a group in Abu Dhabi. We are close to launching a Spanish language edition with a group in Mexico that's going to be for all of Latin America as well as Spain. And next spring, we're launching a Japanese language edition. And we are in talks to do a Portuguese language edition, principally for Brazil, but also, Portugal and there are countries in Africa that, because of colonialism, speak Portuguese
Right.
as well. So we view that as really important, because these publications are not just going to republish what we do in their languages. They're going to start doing that. But over time, they're going to begin publishing their own articles. So for example, our Chinese partner, they now publish original articles about things going on in China every day, along with the stuff that we're doing. And so over time, all of these other publications will be doing the same, and we'll be exchanging articles. So our sort of grand vision is to have this huge network. And those aren't the only languages. We want to do more, but have a huge network of publications that are sharing articles and ideas with one another.
That's great. I mean, I would go back first. I mean, this is incredible to see that SSIR is thinking of so many publications. But I would like to still make one comment about when you mentioned, Eric, that there are not enough publications capturing social innovation. So even when you mention something like IDR in a country of 1.3 billion people, one publication. I mean, imagine the space. Probably if we have I don't know, if we have 100, that would still not be enough, right? And even in a country like India, or a country anywhere, even in United States for that matter, there's enough diversity that publications can be actually capturing local news. And though we all tend to, I mean, I know I'm trying to understand in my head that one is very important to have this global presence like Bloomberg you have talked about. Second thing, probably it's equally important to look at why do we only understand and hear about states during elections? I mean, why do you not hear about what's happening in different states in the United States as a consistent thing even in social innovation field? So I mean, room to grow and room to work, whether you want to do depth within the same country or you want to breadth globally in the world is huge. But somehow, I mean, and that's where I would like to link it to my next question to you, is that I mean, what are we missing? What are the skills and values do we see which are very, very critical going forward? I mean, you can give your views on journalism, and you talked about
Mhm.
Solution Circle, and you talked about a lot of that. But for the sake of, like, the social impact community we are part of, and the young people who are listening to you, what are the
Right.
skills and values we need that will play a critical role defining the next decade now?
Yeah. Um, well, there's so many. I'll just say that, right? Um, but a few kind of stick out in my mind. And I don't know if it's a skill per se, but I think people who know how to work across boundaries, what are so-called boundary crossers, I think that's a really important skill, attribute, set of experiences. People that know, we talk about public-private partnerships and collective impact. It's much easier to do that if you've worked in government and the private sector and nonprofits, because you know how they think, right? I mean, these sectors really do have kind of different sets of values and language and all of that. And so for people to have those experiences, and I do see that more and more. I see people deliberately, getting jobs in a variety of these areas, and as part of their effort to become effective people in social change. So that's one thing. I also think a certain, leadership is important, right? And not just any kind of leadership. I think, again, since we're talking about a lot of kind of collaborative work, what's called system leadership, the kind of traditional hierarchical top-down model is really going away. Even in big corporations, it really kind of doesn't work, because young people, they don't really put up with that
Right.
as much as they used to. And I think, so the people that have but leadership is important, right? It's not like we can have just everybody kind of going off and doing what they want. And so I think, that's a highly valued and actually a skill that it can be learned, but not many people learn it, I also think finance, and I say that because I think one of the biggest problems in the social sector is lack of capital. That's just persistent, and which is one of the reasons why I think the rise of impact investing has been so important, because it does bring in potentially huge sources of capital. But again, you have to have people who know how to do that. So you mentioned, MacArthur Foundation and Ford. One of the things interesting that they've done, and maybe you'll talk about this with them when they come, is they actually issued bonds.
Right.
MacArthur was, I think, $150 million bond. Ford was a $1 billion bond. And they did it because interest rates are so low. It's like their 30-year bonds at 1.5%. It's almost like free money. And they're using that to, suddenly have a huge influx of money that they can use now, pay off over 30 years. Presumably, their endowments earn more than 1.5%. And for example, Darren Walker, who's the head of the Ford Foundation, used to work on Wall Street. So he gets money. He knows how to come up, and I don't know if this was Darren's brainchild, but I actually think it kind of was. And he's creative with financing, right? And so, like, creative new ways of raising money, getting money, I think that's just like super critical. And also say digital technology. It's not like everyone has to be a coder, but you certainly have to be conversant in what are the possibilities of using data and digital technology and machine learning and AI and all of these new things that are just exploding, to use it within your organization to become, more, to increase productivity, to lower your costs, to do things that you could never even think of doing, to scale up well beyond, chatbots, right? That's something. Think if you had to have some individual like actually doing the chat for these instead of a chatbot, right? And so I think, that's one thing. The social sector is still woefully behind the private sector in its use of that stuff. It's getting better, but I think that's a skill that's also super important. And then the last thing I want to mention is, it's not all techniques. I think, empathy is super important. Because, without that, then I think, it's one thing to be able to have an organization and to very efficiently go about solving a problem, but I think empathy, both for people that you work with but also for the people you're working for, is just very important.
No, thank you for touching upon that, Eric. I also like leadership is something which has been talked about, and probably we can have endless debate on what kind of leaders do we need, keeping in mind that United States just got lucky. And but at the same time, I think what you mentioned around innovative financing, people coming in from financial acumen, looking at different ways of financial products, which is going to be the next very, very critical thing for the social impact sector. Not just from a foundation's perspective, but I think even for the appetite of NGOs and civil society to learn about these financial products and try to access them, implement solutions which are more outcome driven. Though there's again, as you know, there's a debate of like not everything can be measured in terms of outcomes, like especially when we talk about things like climate change and complex societal problems. But Eric, I would love to know, I know we have talked about a lot, but I think I would love to know in this last 15 years of working for SSIR, what has been your own personal journey, challenges, evolution? 1.5 decades is a long, long time. Or rather, you can talk about it for your entire career because it's incredible journey.
Yeah, so people often, the question comes up like, well, so how did you get to where you're going, right?
Right.
Not to say it wasn't planned. So, I think one thing that, I have 3 kids, and so I've seen, today young people are like very deliberate, which is a good, in some ways is a good thing, but it's like they kind of know what they're going to do when they're like 15 and they just sort of march ahead. And I think that's fine, but it's also the case that you have to be open to opportunities and to twists in the road and things you didn't think about. And again, the context of this talk is future of work. Well, it is going to change, right? So like you have to be open to change, willing to change, adept at changing. And I'd say that's one thing that I've been actually pretty good at over the years. But the reason I ended up here, it's kind of a funny path, because when I was, so I'm 67, and so I grew up during the Vietnam War, which I objected to strongly. And as I got toward draft age, I started to become quite active against the Vietnam War. Fortunately, I missed being drafted because what they were doing was a lottery and my number was too high to get drafted. But in the course of protesting against the war, I became just sort of involved in other things. And I'll mention one little story. Grew up in Minneapolis, which is very white, very middle class, very prosperous. Not that everybody is, but it's kind of like that. And we moved to San Diego for a variety of reasons. And shortly after we got to San Diego, and this was when I was 12 or 13, we went over the border, because San Diego is like right on the border with Mexico. And there's a city there called Tijuana, which is actually a huge city. It's probably close to 2 million people. And you cross this border and suddenly you were in a completely different world. I mean, the poverty was just incredible. This was 67, 68. And there was also a lot of political upheaval, as you know, in 68. That was when the Olympics were in Mexico City, and hundreds, and some say more, students were killed by the Mexican government. And so it was just like, the times were just upheaval. So I became very involved in politics, ended up joining a socialist organization of all things, which is funny when I tell people that, because I wait, you work at Forbes magazine and you were in a socialist group? I don't get it. But I was in a socialist organization. In fact, I became on the executive committee and was one of the leaders of it. and we were involved in a lot of trade union work, community organizing, health, even electoral politics. And over time, I eventually kind of began to have some doubts about the practicality of socialism. And at the same time, I got involved in becoming a journalist, because at the time I was, before I went to journalism school, I was working as a nurse's aide in hospitals doing union organizing, and I couldn't see myself doing that for the rest of my life. So I went to journalism school and I found I really liked it, and then I was in San Francisco and ended up in the early 80s. And as you know, Silicon Valley was just starting to take off. So I ended up just by chance covering technology companies. And one of the things that I was really impressed by that, and covering the businesses, that these tech companies weren't what I thought was like what businesses were, right? I mean, back in those days, you thought business was General Motors, but it turned out that it was actually, tech companies were very creative. They actually kind of shared wealth with their employees through stock options. They created products that were new and innovative and actually, useful, rather than just sort of changing the upholstery on the car's seats every year. And so I was really impressed with it. And so I kind of ended up having this funny mix of social consciousness that I didn't lose. I was still very concerned about issues like poverty and health, but also really cognizant of what role innovative organizations like these tech companies, Silicon Valley companies, could play in, bringing computing power to people that in the past we didn't have. So then the opportunity came to join SSIR, and I was like, oh my God, it's like, this is my place. It's like, having a social consciousness, how do we solve social problems? And how do we do it in innovative ways, making use of all the tools that we have, right? Social movements are important, trade unions are important. But at the end of the day, you do have to have organizations that can actually create interesting and important products, right? And businesses are actually kind of good at that. So anyway, this ended up being the perfect place for me. And I've also sort of helped craft, I think, what we do, right? I mean, the idea of thinking that social innovation is something where we need the work of all sectors of society. Innovation is important, but not forgetting about what it is we're trying to solve. So, I mean, issues of, power and equity and fighting racism and things are, embedded in what we do. So that's kind of my path, which is not anything I could have ever predicted when I was 18 or 21.
So it's an incredible journey. I mean, as you said, like, how from a socialist publication to Fortune to back to SSIR, which probably balances out both the sides very well. Looking, because innovation is not restricted, or social innovation broadly is not restricted to any one industry. As we know, even the corporates are good in innovating and solving for large scale problems. Which brings me to my, and I know we have very, very limited time left, but which I would still like to know, what trends do you see, Eric, going forward in terms of articles, topics? I know you mentioned that SSIR looks for innovation, looks for advanced technologies, or anything that is innovative and is going to solve large scale problems with evidence. But if you want to give our audience some suggestions on what do you see are the emerging trends in terms of topics that need to be captured, or you are thinking about right now, that would be great.
Yeah. Well, let me just touch on a few, because I know we only have a couple of minutes. I did mention technology. I think that's hugely important, and not just because I'm sitting here in Silicon Valley. We have a conference coming up in February called Data on Purpose, and that explores both the pluses and the minuses of technology. I mean, we've seen a lot of the minuses. I mean, there are biases within algorithms that can mean that people that are trying to get bank loans just get locked out. But that's something that people created and can be undone. And so I think, the power of technology, both, to do good, is something that's super important. And we're just going to see, I mean, some people say, you know, the internet is just kind of the starting point, and I believe that's really true. And now we're going to see things change in just amazing ways. So I think that's one thing we're going to continue to watch. You know, kind of at a more macro level, system change is something that, you know, it's a bit of a buzzword, but I think it's an important thing to look at. And you know, the acknowledgement that, you know, kind of like what we were talking about collective impact, to really solve big problems, these are systems, right? You know, education is a system, you know, health is a system. And how do you go in to change it? And what role do individual organizations play in that process? It's not an easy thing. So if you go to some single organization and go like, what you're doing, you know, it's like, it's just a little piece of the system. You're not going to change anything. Well, that's not very useful. But so what is a useful perspective in thinking about doing system change? Collective impact is certainly one piece of that puzzle, but it's not the only thing. I mentioned co-impact. That's one of the big things that they're focused on, is how do we use philanthropy to really make system change? I think that's a big one. I think we've seen the rise in importance of social movements, particularly, you know, in the U.S. around the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think we sort of forgot about that. We got into kind of technocratic solutions and forgot that, you know, it's really people that ultimately are going to change the world. And how do you get people involved and passionate? And then how do you channel that energy in a productive way? But I think looking at the balance between, you know, you're talking about technology on the one hand and social movements on the other. I mean, these things are related and can be used together. And then new forms of philanthropy. We talked about that at the beginning, but there's things that even go beyond philanthropy. So a lot of the new wealthy people here in the US, like Larry Paul Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg, they're not just getting grants. They are investing in companies. They are contributing money to electoral campaigns. They're doing that out of limited liability corporations rather than setting up a traditional foundation. It gives them much more flexibility. And I think that's just one example, but philanthropy itself is, I think, really going to be changing, and we're interested in seeing how that plays out.